Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm Jenny Small, the Associate Director of the Mandel Center, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this special event, which we are co-hosting with the Journal of Jewish Education. Today's event is part of our work at the Mandel Center to support scholarship related to Jewish education and to share important ideas within the field of Jewish education. And with that very brief welcome, I want to introduce my colleague, Nicole Samuel, who will be moderating today's session. Nicole is an associate research scientist at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies here at Brandeis. Along with Sharon Avni, Nicole was one of the editors of the special issue of the Journal of Jewish Education, which focused on anti-Semitism on campus after October 7th, which our panelists will be discussing today. Nicole, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I'm excited to welcome everyone to today's webinar. As Jenny said, my name is Nicole Samuel, and I'm Associate Research Scientist at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. The special issue of the Journal of Jewish Education is dedicated to anti-Semitism on American campuses after the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. Today's webinar is an opportunity to learn from 4 scholars who contributed to the special issue. The special issue was fast-tracked in order to capture this extraordinary moment in American Jewish life and will be released in the coming weeks. Before I introduce our scholars, I want to share some background about the special issue. The editorial board of the Journal of Jewish Education decided in early June 2024 to devote a special issue to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on American college campuses. Members of the editorial board had watched tensions around the Israel-Hamas war escalate and play out on their own universities. It was clear to the journal's board that the turmoil on campus had implications for Jewish education and for Jewish life more broadly. This special issue is the first time that the journal has devoted a full issue to contemporary anti-Semitism, which in itself is a statement about the profound sociocultural changes shaping American Jews today. Much has been written about the situation on American campuses after October 7th. It was discussed on social media and in traditional news sources, in congressional hearings, in boardrooms, and around dinner tables. Today, we have the opportunity to learn from 4 different studies focused on the experience of Jewish students during the 2023-24 academic year. I'm pleased to introduce to you 4 scholars who led these studies. Joining us today are Vikki Katz from Chapman University, Rebecca Coburn from Columbia University, Jonathan Krasner from Brandeis University, and my colleague Graham Wright, also from Brandeis University. You can see their bios, which are being posted in the chat. I want to share a few logistics before we begin our session. The session will run approximately 70 minutes. I have several questions for the panelists to respond to, and we'll also take questions from you, our audience. I encourage the audience to engage with our panelists by submitting questions in the chat using the Q&A button throughout the webinar. I will take these questions toward the end. Please note that we are recording today's session. It will be available afterwards on the Mandel Center website, on a YouTube channel, and as part of the Brandeis Mandel Center podcast series, which will allow you to revisit this discussion at your convenience. Again, thank you for joining us for this important conversation, and I look forward to a lively and insightful discussion. So let's begin. So I have a question for the 4 panelists, which is, how did you develop the research that is included in the special issue? Did it emerge from previous work that you did, from interactions with students or events on campus? I'm curious what led you to this particular study, or to your particular study. I'm going to start with Graham.
Hi, thanks, Nicole. So what drove us to the paper that we wrote, which is titled What Crosses the Line? Understanding the Boundaries of Anti-Semitism and Criticism of Israel Through the Perspective of Jewish College Students. So the genesis of this paper was our recognition that, there's a lot of agreement that anti-Semitism on campus is bad and they should do something about it. And the main focus of the disagreement is not whether anti-Semitism is bad, is how do you define it and how do you decide what is and is not anti-Semitic. And obviously that question is most salient in regard to questions about statements or beliefs or actions related to Israel. The question is, at what point do statements or beliefs about Israel, even if they don't mention Jews explicitly, cross the line into anti-Semitism? And so far, people have been trying to the most common way of answering this question is through what Sergio Della Pergola calls top-down approaches to defining anti-Semitism. So some authoritative group or figure like ERA or JDA or Nexus, these sort of organizations, will sort of articulate a sort of top-level definition of here are the general parameters of what is and is not anti-Semitic, and then people will sort of look at those definitions and try to apply them in specific cases. And there's some benefits to that approach, but there are also some limitations. And our argument in the paper is that, especially when you're dealing with the situation on campus, there's another approach that may also be effective, which is what Sergio calls a bottom-up approach, where you actually draw on data about how the Jewish students experiencing anti-Semitism think about it, right? What sort of things do they think is or is not anti-Semitic? And that approach to sort of defining the contours of anti-Semitism makes a lot of sense if we're thinking about anti-Semitism as a social problem that we're trying to solve, right? We want to make sure that we, as the people who are trying to do something about it, understand the social problem in the same way as the people experiencing it. So we tried to do this with a pair of surveys of Jewish college students. One was conducted right after October 7th in the fall of 2023. Another one was done in the spring of 2024. Together, they have over 4,000 respondents, and these are Jews at 60 or so relatively elite schools that had the highest estimated Jewish populations. So most of the schools you're thinking of that have been in the news about have lots of Jews in them are in this sample. And in both of the surveys, we gave our Jewish respondents a set of statements, and we asked them, do you think this statement is definitely anti-Semitic, probably anti-Semitic, probably not anti-Semitic, definitely not anti-Semitic? And what we found when we did that is that really the Jewish students broadly tended to think about anti-Semitism in similar ways to how these sort of top-down definitions articulated it. So over 90% of the Jewish students we talked to in both surveys, they thought that sort of traditionally anti-Jewish ideas like Jews have too much power, they thought that was anti-Semitic, and they thought the same thing about statements like Israel does not have a right to exist. About 80% also felt that the statement from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, was anti-Semitic, at least probably. But there was much greater diversity of opinion in regard to statements about whether Israel's an apartheid state or committing genocide. And the majority did not think that simply saying that Israel violates human rights is anti-Semitic. And there's actually relatively little change in how people responded to these questions between 2023 and 2024. And so what this tells us is that the Jewish students actually have a fairly nuanced understanding of the relationship between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. They don't inherently think that all criticism is anti-Semitic, but there's broad agreement that certain statements are. And we think that this sort of data can give educators a sort of useful and realistic frameworks for how to discuss anti-Semitism in today's very fraught political climate.
Thanks, Graham. Next, I'm going to turn to Jonathan. Jonathan, how did you develop the research that you wrote about in the special issue? I'm curious, you're a historian, so tell us where this emerged from.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for convening this, Nicole. And it's great to see other authors from the special issue here together. So hi to everybody. Yeah, so I'm coming from a really different place. I usually am writing about Jewish history, and as Rebecca, who's also a historian on this panel, would probably agree with me, it's much easier to write about people who are dead who can't talk back to you than it is to talk about people who are here and loud and have opinions. But my research really emerges from a personal experience that I had. I was teaching on campus during the semester when October 7th happened. And as it turned out, just coincidentally, I was teaching a course on the teaching of Israel. And so I had a lot of students in that course who were processing what was going on in Israel after October 7th, and I found that my office hours were kind of becoming something of therapy sessions as well, and I welcome the opportunity for students to come and to process how they were feeling, and then. By November, what had happened was that a small but vocal pro-Palestine or anti-Israel group had emerged on campus. The campus administration had banned Students for Justice in Palestine on our campus, and there was a reaction to that on the Brandeis campus. There were protests. People were arrested, and it was really interesting to listen to my students process what was going on. You might have thought, especially the Jewish students, would have felt like they were being protected by the administration and their actions around the students who were protesting. But they had much more nuanced opinions about it. They really felt like what the administration, many of them felt like what the administration was doing was actually backfiring against the Jewish community on campus. And so I began to wonder whether the students at Brandeis were typical of students more generally. And that was the genesis for my study, which looked at students across the United States on 24 campuses and 16 states in the District of Columbia. And unlike Graham's study, mine is a qualitative study. So we were talking with students, we were interviewing students, and trying to understand where they were coming from, how they were feeling, both about the war, both about what was going on in the Middle East and what was going on their campuses, including the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that they were experiencing or not experiencing, as the case may be, on their campuses. So that's kind of where my study comes from, and I'll share some of the findings that that we saw later on. But it was really interesting to see just the variety of experiences that people have. I think that one thing that often gets lost is that campuses are diverse, and there are a few campuses like Columbia, where Rebecca is, and Harvard, and a few other campuses that get a lot of the media attention. But actually, when you look across the United States, students are experiencing a variety of different environments, and it's important to remember that. And that has a lot to do with how they're processing what they're going through.
Thanks, Jonathan. Vikki, can you tell us about your work?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I am a communication scholar, background in sociology, and so quite different from the historians on the panel. I'm used to people who talk back, especially because I study young people. I've for many years looked at kids, adolescents, and emerging adults, and how technology engagement and access affects their development. I've looked at this across issues related to equity, learning in and out of school for immigrant, low-income, blue-collar kids, and emerging adults. And over recent years, have become more and more interested in how those dynamics affect political polarization for young people, and the role that social media plays in how politically polarized this upcoming generation thinks we are. I was teaching my class on communication and civil discourse, where we spend a lot of time focusing on how did we get so politically polarized in America when October 7th occurred. October 9th, I walked into the classroom to talk about how political worldviews get formed, and kind of cleared the desk and said, okay, we're going to talk about how this happens in a very different part of the world. And so my study really emerged very much from my prior research, but with a focus on Jewish young people and their peers. The questions that I had were really about how the post-October 7th period was affecting young Jews in ways that would be harder to pick up on a survey. So I did in-depth interviews. I wanted to understand how young Jews on college campuses, American Jews, not children of Israelis or Israelis, because it's a very different experience, the majority still would define themselves as being politically left of center, whether that's liberal, progressive, Democrat, et cetera, but left of center, about 80% at that time would define themselves that way. And I was curious how shifts in their Jewish identities after October 7th, both in relation to Israel, but also in response to rising anti-Semitism in the US, how those changes in their Jewish identities and in their political identities and affiliations, how they were making sense of that, especially as being Jewish and being Zionist became outright, sort of unavoidably persona non grata in spaces that were center, left, or progressive. How were they figuring that out? How were they making sense of these new conditions? I wanted to understand how social media was acting as a passive educator for them as to which peers they could talk to or try to talk to about these very raw and difficult experiences, and when they were deciding to step forward and try to talk to non-Jewish peers, but also why they weren't. And so I did in-depth interviews with Jewish students all over the country, 20 students, all of whom defined themselves as being left of center, campuses that were very different in size and geography, but all students who hadn't been sort of the kid who was at Hillel or Chabad every Friday night. I wanted to talk to students who hadn't been deeply, deeply involved in Jewish community life, because those were the kids who would be least likely to have had a ready circle of people to interpret things with. And I really wanted it to be visible to them how their perspectives had changed. About a quarter of those 20 students told me that they had a non-Jewish friend that they had had ongoing and really good conversations with, even when they disagreed with each other, that they'd been able to engage in civil discourse from over time and over months. And so when encampments went up in the spring of that year, I re-interviewed those kids with that non-Jewish friend to have them puzzle through with me why they had been able to do what so few students seemed to be able to do, which was to have respectful and robust and empathetic and effective agreement and disagreement about what was happening both on college campuses and in the Middle East. Because this is a tactic known as positive deviance, where you see something that's exceptional that you want to be less exceptional, right? The ability of young people to really talk to each other. How do we look at the people who are managing to do it anyway, even when it's difficult, to see what can be taught? And a lot of those skills are communication skills. And I wanted to understand that so that we could start developing better ways to support young people in being able to have that kind of civil discourse around the conflict and around the place of American Jews in this country. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Vikki. I'm going to turn to Rebecca. We're not going to put the link to Rebecca's article in the chat yet, because as I said earlier, this special issue is forthcoming, so it's not yet published. But Rebecca, your article, your research area was your own university. It was closer to home. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I just want to thank Nicole, and I also want to thank the staff and editors of the Journal of Jewish Education for just working with me, because this is totally new research for me. I wanted to think about how Columbia, which has been proclaimed by the media the epicenter and has been covered a lot, to actually try to understand what actually unfolded on campus. And I often found it very interesting that the media was actually barred from campus, but they were still writing about it. So what my research is based on student research and student materials that they collected. And I will explain that. And I hope it's going to just put information out there to have people understand the complexity of what unfolded. So the title of my paper is Anti-Israelism, Social Media and the College Campus in the Aftermath of 10/7, the Case of Columbia. And indeed, it grew out of what I was seeing on campus. Like Jonathan said, I normally work on Jews who have been dead for at least 150 years. And I, don't normally work in the present, but I could not believe what I was seeing, the amount of activism, the type of activism. Similarly, my office became flooded with students, and, my job was transformed on October 7th, as pastoral care. But most importantly, there were students who had to drop classes. This is because Columbia has over 170 Israeli students who served in the IDF, and some were called up, others dropped for other reasons. So what my paper is based on is the research. They had to take classes. They did independent studies with me because they had to make up classes because they had to graduate. they did independent studies with me and collected information on what I asked them, what is not being talked about in the media that you think is important? So the two main things that they collected were social media posts, particularly from the app called SideChat, which I will talk about, and how it was used in the aftermath of 10/7 and how that differed from before and how that indeed changed the whole atmosphere on campus. And one of the students created a survey of Israeli students. So it's important to understand there are 170 Israeli students, mostly through the School of General Studies, which its niche is it has veterans. So many of them are older than the traditional Columbia student, and they have their own WhatsApp because many issues that they are dealing with, like how to find an apartment, they live a very different. So that WhatsApp group was used. It has 170 members for this survey in which 30% responded. And it is a very, it's quantitative and qualitative, but one of the great, I shouldn't say fortunes of it is he did it at the end of the semester. So he launched it on April 3rd and he finished the survey on May 3rd, which was exactly the dates that the encampment was up at Columbia. So in many ways, the students who were responding to that. So in many ways, I would say one of the most important uh, revelations of my study is this whole issue of anti-Israelism. And indeed, it's very interesting to think of the Israelis on campus who do not see themselves as they don't identify as Jewish students. They don't go to Hillel. Some do go to Chabad, but overall, they don't identify that. And one wrote in the qualitative studies that I did after, the notion that they would call themselves a Zionist is not something they normally say, but their whole family lives in Israel and so does all their friends. And therefore, when the rhetoric, both online and what I would call the virtual campus and the live campus, was about the destruction of Israel, how that made them feel and their sense of belonging on campus. So my study, which as I say in it, and it was based literally on students' research, I could not have done it without them, really makes us think of how anti-Israelism should be a term we should also be thinking about when we're thinking about campus in this post-October 7th time. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think as our audience can see, one of the really unique things about this special issue is that we have a number of studies that come from people who aren't typical contributors to the Journal of Jewish Education. And so we think that also says something about this particular moment for American Jewry. The special issue included studies that utilize both quantitative and qualitative research methods. I'm really curious, Graham, why did you choose quantitative research to look at students' understanding of anti-Semitism? How was it the right method or tool for your particular study? And I'm going to ask the same question of Vikki. How did you choose, why did you choose qualitative research, and how was that the right method for you? Let's start with Graham.
Yeah, so I teach research methods at Brandeis, and one of the things that I tell students is there's no such thing as a bad method. There's just a method that's appropriate or not for answering particular kinds of questions. And so, one of the things, a quantitative study like the one we did, where you give a lot of people of ideally a fairly strictly defined sample. You give them all the same questions, and then you analyze them using numbers and statistics and things. That sort of approach is really good at answering questions about how many people think this, or do people who think this also think that, right? And so if the question is, do most Jews on campus think that statement X is anti-Semitic? If you want to answer that kind of question, you can't talk to every Jewish student on campus. If you want to know if it's 90% or 20% or somewhere in the middle, you need to be pretty confident that the group that you did talk to is in some way representative of the larger group. And that requires talking to a lot of people, even if it's not everybody, in our case, several thousand, and doing various things to try to make sure that your sample is at least as best as you can understand, representative. And this is what statistical tests and things like that are supposed to tell us, is what's the chance that you just got unlucky in the kinds of people that you talk to, that you happen to get a group that was more pro-Israel or less pro-Israel or whatever than the group. So we chose it because it was the right tool for answering the particular kind of question that we're interested in. And as I'm sure Vikki will talk about, qualitative research is better for other kinds of questions that were not the focus of our study.
Thanks, Graham. Vikki, why did you choose long-form interviews for your work?
Sure. So to echo what Graham said, I mean, as a researcher, you pick the tool that fits the thing you're trying to examine. And so for what I wanted to look at, which is how young people were making sense of identity dynamics and how they talk to each other, and then actually re-interviewing some of the students with their peers to have them puzzle through in real time what they were doing, surveys would have been an inappropriate choice. Because what I really wanted to do was go in deeply and see with a smaller number of people what those kinds of dynamics were like and how people were identifying for themselves the sources of how they account for changes in themselves, their motivations for change in those identities, how they're ascribing meaning to the things that other people are doing around them. Those kinds of things require giving people open-ended questions so that they can really dig in their answers with you. But I will say that the campuses and students we picked in order to make sure that we had the kind of diversity that would make for a study where, just like Graham, we weren't going to feel like, did we pick a set of students who were only telling us one thing? We actually relied on the work that Graham and his colleagues had done on campus hotspots to ensure that we interviewed students on campuses that reflected sort of spots that were kind of high temperature, moderate, and lower temperature, so that we could see those variations. And one of the interesting findings from that variation is that even students on campuses where there was relatively less activity were not necessarily less preoccupied by what was going on. And a lot of that is because social media gives them instant access to what kids like them are experiencing in other places in a way that feels incredibly immediate, even when they don't know those students directly. It's almost like a distorted version of an imagined community, right? Where they can immediately put themselves in the place of a student at Columbia or at another place where things are much worse, and can easily kind of identify with it. We also looked for diversity beyond, campus hotspots, diversity in terms of student background to make sure that we didn't have a sample that was entirely Ashkenazi. I interviewed students who had Israeli flags in the background of their Zoom screen, and I interviewed students who would define themselves as either anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, that they'd simply feel ambivalent about it. But the majority of students identified themselves as both being left of center, but also being deeply Zionist, whether that was a label they claimed or that they had a really strong belief in the continued prosperity of a Jewish homeland, even if the label itself felt problematic to them, that they really believed in it, and perhaps more so than they ever have in their lives. Because it felt more necessary than it ever had. And for one of the really rich things that came out of these interviews is that for a lot of these young people, especially if they didn't have family in Israel and they hadn't spent time there themselves, this was the first time that they really felt what's been referred to as the pain of peoplehood, where they really felt a clear and direct link to Israelis and the sense that they are part of a shared people, even if it's a country they haven't seen and even if it's people that they don't know. And so those are the kinds of things that a qualitative study can do, is go very deep with a smaller number of people, which is a good complement for how surveys can go broader with a larger number of people, but not be able to get necessarily the same level of depth.
We're going to add hotspots to the chat just so people can it's happening. So people can see how the 50 campuses were selected, and they were campuses with larger Jewish student populations, just in case we get any questions about that. One of the things that you all have discussed since our opening is that there are different terms to describe what we saw on campus after October 7th and what we're seeing in our society today: anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism. And some terms like anti-Semitism have more than one accepted definition. What can we learn from these different terms and different definitions, Graham?
Well, so I think one of the things that I think we should just be open, like I think that we have to start by recognizing that different people use words in different ways. Um, and that, and you know, the whole paper that we wrote is sort of about how Jewish students agree or disagree about what the term anti-Semitism mean, or what sort of attitudes it encompasses. But that's true about a lot of the debates about these issues. I think are sometimes even more contentious than they would be otherwise because of people just using words in different ways. And so one example is the term Zionism. So we actually avoid using that term. We don't use it anywhere in the paper, and that's very conscious. And we didn't use it anywhere in the survey because our observation is that people use that term to mean a lot of different things. Some people use the term Zionist, and these are people who identify that way or don't. They use the term Zionist to mean I support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state or something like that. And thus anti-Zionism is I do not support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. And some people use it to mean I really like Israel, or I really like what the Israeli government is doing or something like that, and thus define anti-Zionism as I really don't like what the Israeli government is doing, or I don't feel so great about Israel or something like that. And so one of the things that we had to decide was we made a decision to not ask students, do you identify as a Zionist or not, and to not use that term, even though it's a very important term, and it's maybe worth another paper to figure out, you know, what percentage of people think it means different things. So this is where I think both, you know, the value of research can tell us both at a quantitative level, like what percentage of people think a word means this or that, and then at the qualitative level, dig deeper, like, okay, what do you really mean, right? Even the students that we talked to who said, well, I think saying that from the river to the sea, that statement, they think it's anti-Semitic. What our survey doesn't get at is why they think it's anti-Semitic. Our hypothesis is that they think it's anti-Semitic because they interpret it as an expression of support for Hamas. And now, of course, the people chanting that slogan, at least some of them probably don't mean it that way. They probably mean something else. And that would be a really, you know, really interesting qualitative study to interview those students to try to figure out, like, well, what do you really think this statement means, and why does it make you feel this or that way? And so just recognizing that people disagree about these things, I think, is an important first step.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, you wrote about anti-Israelism, and that's a term that you use to describe what the students at Columbia experience. Can you tell us about what we can learn about anti-Israelism from your research?
Yeah, so I think in some ways, and Graham, it's a very useful article just to be thinking about these terms have become mired in controversy in themselves. And anti-Israelism is really a new term. Jonathan Karp basically is the first one who wrote about it, I think in 2024, January 2024, specifically as a category for thinking about this moment. And I want to just say the students, this is from the students, they felt that the rhetoric, they didn't want to get mired in, is this anti-Semitism? Is this anti-Zionism? When someone says to you, I want to burn Tel Aviv to the ground, they interpret that as anti-Israel rhetoric. And the other part of what I focus on is a lot of the rhetoric, and this is only between November 2023 and May 2024, was on focusing on the people who have served in the IDF. and, quote, getting people, they call it the IOF, the Israel Occupation Forces, getting those people off campus. So it is important to understand that my study, because it's based on a survey of Israeli students, has more Israelis weighing in, but they see anti-Israelism as a key concept for understanding what took place on Columbia more than any of the other concepts, because as one student said in the survey and then said in a follow-up interview, they would never describe themselves as Jewish. That's not the way they self-identify. And then, the notion of being a Zionist, they also felt was a little bit outdated term, but they are from Israel. They served in the IDF. It is who they are. Their whole family is there and their friends. And therefore, the rhetoric against Israel was what they found most troubling and made them their sense of belonging on campus. That's ultimately what the article is about, how they felt alienated from campus.
Interesting, by virtue of their Israeli nationality.
Yes.
Yeah. And I just on this point, this is related to something I guess someone asked in the Q&A about the alignment of what we found with definitions like era. And I think one of the interesting things is that our sort of bottom-up approach points to the areas where these sort of definitions don't always provide enough detail for you to know these sorts of things. So, for example, one of the things that ERA says is that one of the ways that ERA thinks about criticism of Israel potentially being anti-Semitic or not is it says criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Where it crosses the line is when it becomes disproportionate, right? And so what that tells you is, and this sort of runs through a lot of these definitions, is how to figure out whether, if someone says certain bad thing about Israel, you kind of have to know what they've been saying about other countries to know how to interpret that in light of ERA. And it gets very complicated, especially if someone's just saying that one thing. And so this is, we're trying to be very careful that we're not trying to use our research to come up with a fourth definition of anti-Semitism. We're just telling people when Jewish students say that they're concerned about anti-Semitism, this is generally the kind of stuff that they are concerned about right now. In a year or 2 years or 3 years, they might think differently as the context for anti-Semitism and the relationship of anti-Semitism to Israel, and obviously the situation in Israel, is changing all the time. And that means that the way that they interpret these concepts changes too.
I thank you, Graham. I know we have a number of Jewish educators and communal professionals and community leaders who are joining us today. So I'm curious, from the research, what do Jewish educators and leaders need to know about anti-Semitism on campus? In particular, what is something from the research, from your article, that might surprise observers of the Jewish community or parents of Jewish college students? Jonathan.
Great. So I'd say that there are some general takeaways from my research that I think can be very informative for the different populations that you just spoke of. One of the first things that I think that is probably helpful for everyone to understand is that talking about binaries when dealing with opinions on campus is often very misleading. Yes, there are definitely a small but vocal group of students, Jewish students, who have joined the protests. And yes, there is a group of students for whom responding to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus has become their cause, and it strengthened their Jewish identity. And we saw immediately after October 7th, there was a rise in the number of Jews who were going to Jewish organizations like Chabad or Hillel on campus, although our colleague Eitan Hirsch has found that that has leveled off and even sort of gone back to the mean of where it was before October 7th. So that was a short-term kind of bubble. But I want to focus on, I think like the majority of students on campus, the majority of Jewish students on campus, is they would inhabit what I would call the missing middle. These are students who are struggling with what is going on or who are actively avoiding what is going on. They are dealing with it on all sorts of levels. They're trying to educate themselves about what's going on in Israel. Some of them are worried about their emotional safety, if not always their physical safety on campuses. Some of them are taking off identifiably Jewish articles of clothing, like, for example, a Jewish star necklace. Some of them are worried about wearing kippot, head coverings, Jewish head coverings on campus. So you have a group of students out there, a large group of students out there, who are not necessarily engaging in the rhetoric around the conflict, but who may be thinking about the conflict, who aren't sure how they feel about the conflict, who have nuanced ideas about the conflict, both the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict on their campuses. So I call, as I said, those are the missing middle. And I think that we often forget about that missing middle. And I think that when we think about policy, we have to remember that policies that only are targeted at the extremes miss that vast sort of majority of people who are struggling on these campuses. So that's one takeaway. Another takeaway that that I had is that I'm not trying to blame anybody, but what we heard over and over again from students is that their Israel education did not serve them well in K through 12. And that is whether they went to day schools, whether they went to religious schools, whether they went to Sunday schools, whether they went to camps. Now, I know that it's retrospective, and if you talk to educators, they may have a different idea about what actually went on in the classes than the students do. That's totally normal. But I think we spoke with students across the spectrum, and the thing that we heard over and over again is that either the conflict was completely avoided, that teachers were very reticent to talk about the conflict in honest terms, or they quickly would sort of go to these kind of rosy, shiny sorts of myths about Israel, startup Israel, cherry tomato Israel, and that they weren't really dealing with the real life Israel in all its complexity that exists. And that many of these students felt that really did not prepare them well for what they were experiencing on campuses. It was hard for them to interpret, and that they were, then. I know I hear a lot of communal leaders talk about, oh my God, students are getting all of their information from TikTok, or they're getting all of their information, from Instagram. Well, yeah, I mean, some students are getting their information from social media, but that's where people go in that generation to find this information. And if you've avoided this topic for 12 years, and now you're upset because that's where they're getting their information from, well, I mean, that's on you. So I think that that's another takeaway that we heard loud and clear from the students who we spoke with.
Thanks, Jonathan. Vikki, I'm curious, from your conversations with students, from your interviews, what is something surprising that might surprise observers of the Jewish community or parents of college students?
Sure. I'm also imagining that there are some parents on this call because they are thinking about sending a kid to college in a year, 2, 3, 4, and kind of wondering what they could be doing now. And I think what I'm going to say is really reinforcing a lot of what Jonathan's just said, but taking it in a slightly different direction. It's just interesting and good that we found convergent sorts of themes, even though we spoke to different people with different questions. What I found across the interviews was that there were 3 things that emerged in what was kind of underneath what students said that helped to explain why some students felt more like they were more on solid ground with their own perspectives, their own beliefs, their ability to engage in conversation and feel like they had their feet under them, even if they were in that muddled sort of middle, which is where a lot of thinking young Jews are, right? They don't have it all figured out. And in many ways, the more you know about the conflict, the harder it is to stake a clear position in a sentence for a lot of them. But there were three things, and they're things that parents can play a major role in, and they all relate to narrative. The first one was that students who had a clear family narrative of their own family's experience as being refugees, of being displaced, and could draw on that, were much better able to articulate or feel a sense of what it was like to need a homeland, even if their family had never lived in Israel. But families, talk about how your people got here. Talk about what it was. Maybe it's a Holocaust survivor story. Maybe it's many generations removed from that. But the more that students feel rooted in a sense that they are not just quote unquote privileged whites, the easier it is for them to feel some sense of connection to the narratives they hear about the displaced and dispossessed whose families founded and have built the state of Israel without having to make them idealized and perfect. The Israelis can be real people, and it makes it easier for them to see Israelis as real people if they know where their people came from. The second thing is that if kids had spent time in Israel, not on an organized, family trip where they never got any independent time, but where they actually got to do things like, I heard this over and over again, sit in a coffee shop and argue about politics or listen to Israelis argue about politics, that they've developed an authentic, direct connection for themselves with the country. That is maybe even more powerful than it was for previous generations, because after the pandemic and in a generation that's been raised with social media and mediated everything, the students who were able to say, when someone said this is a white supremacist country, or this is whatever term it was, they could turn around and say, have you ever walked down a street in Tel Aviv? Because I have. And if you've walked down a street in Tel Aviv, you know how crazy it is to say that it's a white country. It's changed conversations. It stopped conversations. It opened new ones because it gave them a sense of direct personal authority. So spending time in Israel, if you can, where your kids have some open time where they develop relationships with peers, where they really feel like they've seen it for themselves and not in a sanitized or completely organized sort of way. That's the second form of narrative. And the third is the kids whose parents had modeled for them what it was to hold small L liberal values politically in this country, and that was consonant with being someone who supported the continued thriving of the state of Israel, not in exclusion of Palestinians, but talking openly with them about the complexities of that relationship. Parents who had modeled for them how Israel is a country like any other, and that in many ways mirrors a lot of the issues that this country has, where you've got a democracy that's vibrant and rowdy and has very diverse groups within it, has issues around civil liberties and free speech and all of these things. Parents who had talked to their kids very openly about what Israel's done right and what Israel's done wrong, and that you don't have to be anti-Palestinian to be pro-Israel. If they'd seen their parents do that and have conversations like that around the dinner table about politics in the US and in Israel, they were really, really well prepared for what it felt like to have an integrated identity rather than a political identity that had an Israel exception that was based on feelings rather than facts, because that's where kids start having a much more complicated time. So it's really three forms of narrative, and all of them are ones that parents can directly influence their kids having a strong sense of grounding in.
Interesting. Thanks, Vikki.
Yeah.
One thing I'm thinking about, and I know some in our audience are also thinking about based on some of the questions in the chat, are what's most critical for campus stakeholders, and that, for campus stakeholders to know from your research about the situation for Jewish students after October 7th, and how they might work or move to address anti-Semitism on campus. And when I say campus stakeholders, I'm thinking of alumni. Someone in the chat asked about Jewish alumni specifically, donors, university administrators, Jewish organizations. There are a number of Jewish organizations that have been invested in the campus space, and a number of organizations that have become invested in the campus space since October 7th. Vikki, what do you think is most critical for campus stakeholders to know?
I think one of the things that's really important and that I've seen in teaching a communication and civil discourse class that has focused on the conflict and on campus free speech and protections issues since October 7th, where I get widely different groups every semester. I think the thing that's important to remember is that non-Jewish students in the right environment are overwhelmingly curious and open to how to wrestle with contentious and complex topics in productive ways. To write off whole groups of people as, well, they're getting TikTok educated. We're college educators. We have to start taking the reins on this again. And it can't be anti-Semitism trainings that they take before orientation. I think if campus stakeholders, donors, funders want to invest in making communities, learning communities that are really vibrant places for understanding the Middle East conflict and its relationship to the United States in all its complexities, I think we invest in classes. We invest in educators who are empowered and really well informed themselves on how to help our young people, regardless of their background, to hold more than one thing to be true at a time, and to really wrestle with the history and the current complexities of a region that affects all Americans, whether or not they have direct ties to it. It is our longest standing geopolitical involvement, cutting across administrations on both sides. This is part of being an educated American, not just being a good neighbor to your Jewish friends, although that, of course, is very important too. Doing that kind of work in classrooms gives students a few things that came out of my interviews and that I've seen in my own classroom. One is that it creates guardrails, right? Students are actually expected to do the reading, not just something they can fling at each other that they, go do some reading, go educate yourself. If everybody is reading in a way that they've got a fundamental sort of shared understanding of facts that they can then argue about, evidence that they can argue the veracity of, the relative value of, that's something to start talking about, right? It lets them slow down and really focus on something rather than looking at it for 2 minutes. And it can give them a chance to try and fail and try again in talking about something really complicated. And what I'm envisioning here is not that we invest in this in Jewish studies programs only. I think part of what's happened in the last 20 years is that we've seen a lot of movement where we have a small number of very loud illiberal educators on a lot of college campuses who have made this issue, the Palestinian issue, their reason for being. And they've integrated it into courses across curriculums, across whole units, in ways that mean that students are graduating never having learned that there are actually two sides, two peoples in this conflict at all, right? That they're only hearing it in one side. We can integrate discussion of the conflict into courses that all students take. I mean, when I teach communication and civil discourse, it's not a course for Jewish students. Some semesters I don't have any Jewish students, and some I have a quarter of the class that's either Palestinian or Jewish. But it's something that's for everybody. We can integrate this into political science programs, into history programs, in ways that broaden the conversation by giving students a marketplace of ideas again across campus. It's not enough for us to make sure only that Jewish students are armed with this information, because they need people to talk to. They need allies in the conflicts ahead with regard to how Jews are treated in this country and with regard to Israel's place in the world. They need people to talk to, and we need to make sure we're educating everybody. Classes like that can work on how students move from surface level information to real knowledge development in a digital age, how we develop civil discourse skills in our young people. There are so many ways that across disciplines, we could be integrating real discussion of anti-Semitism and of the Middle East conflict into what we want our students to learn anyway, that by and large, for a lot of good reasons, many people have been skirting. We have to stop skirting it. If there's one thing that could come out of, a renewed and urgent investment in what students are learning on college campuses. Let it be a renewed commitment to ensuring that we have and are hiring educators who are capable of talking within and across different student groups to make understanding these things part of what it means to graduate college, that this is part of what it means to be an informed citizen of the United States in the 2025, and on kind of period.
Thanks, Vikki. We have a question from our audience that relates to this question on campus stakeholders and university administrators. And the question is, what are your recommendations for administrators to balance the need to nurture a welcoming, safe, and inclusive campus community while also preserving rights to free speech among those in the campus community? Rebecca, do you have thoughts on that?
So, Vikki, I want to thank you for your articulate statement that I think the long-term solution is in the classroom. And we have to be committed. It's not only in the classroom about how we teach Israel, how we teach everything, but it is a long-term solution. And if I would say to the administrators, one of the things that when we have all spoken about our articles, the social media point of how this has shaped everything that has transpired since October 7th is really important. And my article talks about side chat, which is just in each campus specific, but the way it was used differently after October 7th, in which students not only threatened each other, they wished Israelis who were going back to fight that hopefully they will die. They literally said, I hope, and they would put his name in it and say, I hope this person. So I think in many ways, and this came from the students, they could not understand how an app that is not run by the university, but does shape the virtual campus and shapes how the students are talking to each other, the notion that that cannot be regulated at all, because it is clear not free speech to wish a specific student who is going back, who is called up, that they hope they die, that cannot be free speech. And I think that this is something that if administrators start thinking about together of how we have the social media, the virtual campus look more like our actual campus. And that I think would make a very big difference for the students from what I found from my research. And, my research is the beginning of many different articles. I hope many people start researching. Columbia was the perfect storm in, people want to blame it on Edward Said. I've read these. It is about a long-term way in which teaching has been taking place, how social activism is seen, but most importantly, about how these students in this post-social media age, post-COVID age, talk to each other when they disagree with each other. And that is something I think that we all can work together to help them communicate better when they don't agree with each other.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you for teaching me about side chat, which I also did not know anything about, even after studying students on campus and those who work on campus. Jonathan, do you want a chance to answer the stakeholder question? I know you answered it in part in the previous answer, but please go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to, thanks for that, Nicole. I do think that there is, I think something for, let's say, campus stakeholders to think about. Rebecca and Vikki have talked really well about trying to find that medium or trying to find that sweet spot between, on the one hand, fostering dialogue, productive dialogue on campus, and on the other hand, making sure that people feel comfortable on campus. And it's not an easy thing, and I don't necessarily, blame administrators when they're not sure exactly where to land on these things. I think that what happened on these campuses is that before October 7th, there were a series of sort of issues that came up in American society where many of these campuses were, of fairly uniform opinions on issues around, let's say, anti-racism or Me Too, or gun violence. And it took October 7th, where there really was a lot of polarization, for people to wake up and realize, hey, we're not teaching the kids, the students, how to really dialogue in a way that is productive, that doesn't degenerate into the kind of hate speech that Rebecca was talking about before. And yeah, we can look at Jonathan Haidt's research on social media and cell phones and how that's contributing to the environment. But one thing that I heard over and over again from the students that I spoke with is that they want to have productive dialogue. They want to talk with other people. It's great that some of the people that Vikki spoke with were able to find non-Jewish friends that they were able to dialogue with. Some of the students I spoke with were also able to find those kinds of people, but a lot of them weren't. And a lot of them also weren't able to talk with their parents about what was going on because their parents, in a well-meaning way, had become like warriors for what was going on campus, and it was getting in the way of the two sides actually listening to each other and reflecting back to each other what they were seeing, what they were feeling, what they were experiencing. We're very good at pointing out how people who we disagree with are living inside of their bubbles, their echo chambers. But we're not always aware of the fact that we ourselves are also operating very often in echo chambers. And one of the things that the students told me is, yes, they're very, very frustrated, a lot of them, the ones that aren't involved in the pro-Palestinian protests, with how their friends, colleagues, classmates are sort of so single-minded with blinders on that they aren't able to productively talk about the conflict and how it degenerates sometimes into the kind of hate speech that we were talking about. But they were equally critical of Hillel and Chabad for creating their own echo chambers, where there were a lot of students who felt like it was all Israel all the time, and that it was a very sort of narrow band of what was seen as acceptable speech and acceptable opinion, and it was turning people away. And so just as there were people that were perhaps seeking Hillel and Chabad as a refuge, there were also a lot of people that we spoke with who were saying, I can't go there because I can't have an honest conversation about how conflicted I'm feeling because I'm expected to toe a certain line, and I'm not gonna, I can't do that. That's not good. That's not where I want to be. So I think that we have to look at ourselves and look at what we're creating on campus as well. And then finally, I think that the campus educators also have to realize that there are a lot of students out there for whom Israel-Palestine is not the center of their Jewish identity. We spoke with a number of students who said, I want to bake challah. I want to celebrate Shabbat. I want to, we even had one student who said, I want to learn Torah. And over the last year, there hasn't been a lot of space to do that because it's all been about Israel-Palestine. Let's remember that we have a lot of students whose Jewish identities are built on a variety of different commitments, and that we want to foster that, and that we don't want to just sort of reduce Jewish identity to one issue, to one commitment, and to create purity tests around that.
Nicole, I wonder if I can say just one more thing, because the
Sure.
issue around balancing free speech and the kinds of protections that other groups have had when there have been things that have bubbled up. I've been involved in a lot of these conversations. I hold an endowed chair in free speech at Chapman, so I end up having these conversations a lot. I think one of the things that comes both from the interviews and from a lot of those conversations is that protection of free speech requires good guardrails and that there's actual enforcement when students cross the line. And that was something whether in my classes, across campus, across these interviews with Jewish and non-Jewish students, it's the same thing as, a group of 5 or 6-year-olds. There's a very deep sense of justice. And, it's like if we are all supposed to obey certain codes of conduct on campus, and we're told to, but then the students who break them just see no consequences for it, what is the point of having them? And I think that one of the things we've seen since October 7th, in these sort of fairly wild swings between how much enforcement there is or isn't, is that for university leaders to have a clear code of conduct, a clear set of consequences when students break those codes of conduct, when they move outside of the bounds of free speech, when they are openly threatening a named student in a social media chat, there should be clear consequences that are content neutral for that, and they must be enforced, because that is how we protect free speech on college campuses, by delineating what is out of bounds. And that has been where college campuses, regardless of which administration we've had politically and how they've been conceiving of these sorts of things, that's where we've seen, I think, a lot of students feel let down by their leadership, is that it feels like there are just no rules.
Thanks, Vikki. All of this discussion of polarization has me thinking about the role of politics in this current moment. And I'm wondering, and Graham, I'm going to ask this of you, what does the research tell us? Does it tell us anything about anti-Semitism on American college campuses and the role of politics or the broader political context of it all?
Yeah. So, I mean, the paper that we have in this special issue looks a little bit at that, at the extent to which Jewish students' feelings about what is or is not anti-Semitic is influenced by their own political views. And the answer is it is related, but it's not totally determined. So, for example, the belief, the statement that was sort of your reaction to it was the most strongly related to your politics was from the river to the sea, that conservatives were more likely to think that that was anti-Semitic than liberals. Liberals were less likely to think it's anti-Semitic than conservatives. But even among liberals, a majority of the Jewish students we talked to still felt it was definitely anti-Semitic. And another 25% felt it was probably anti-Semitic. So, and those numbers were just higher among moderates and conservatives. So, I mean, one of the things here is that politics is important, but it doesn't totally determine how Jewish students think about these things. More broadly, though, I think what not just our research, but research in general has important implications for the way in which the discourse about anti-Semitism on campus has sort of become a national political issue. A lot of different political stakeholders from various sides of the political spectrum have a vested interest in portraying the situation on campus in various ways. And if we want to solve the problem, we need accurate information here's what it's actually going on. And sometimes that accurate information is going to conflict with the narratives on one side or the other. And so this is why research is important. The research that all of us are doing here, it's important to try to figure out, notwithstanding what various people want us to think about this, that here's what's going on. And so this is one of the reasons why, just at the Cohen Center, we're trying to provide schools with that information. And so this piece was a study we did of Jewish students. The hotspots study was another set of another survey that looked at what are the experiences of Jewish students. And then we've used that data and the results of this to then we've done another survey looking at, well, what do non-Jewish students think about Jews in Israel, and how is that related to their political views? And that's another study which I'll put the link into. And that study found, again, a sort of complex result that doesn't necessarily fit with the narrative on one side or the other, where most of the non-Jewish students we talked to didn't really display any hostility towards Jews or express agreement with any of the statements that this study showed that Jewish students thought were anti-Semitic. And we found that real old sort of traditional explicit anti-Semitic hostility was almost as prevalent on these campuses as the sort of Israel-related anti-Semitism that has been the focus of concern here. And that those two things were related to political ideology in very different ways. And so it suggests that anti-Semitism on campus is not one problem, it's a set of problems, and it's a set of problems with different political ramifications. And so this is something that I think you need real good data to sort out what the situation is, because there's such a need for different political actors to frame it in one way or the other.
Thanks, Graham. I I'm certainly a person who appreciates good data. We have 5 minutes left. I want to give all of our panelists a chance to speak, but I just want to clarify really briefly. We have a number of questions from the audience, and one is a clarification about Rebecca's work. So Rebecca, can you clarify what you mean when you say that Israeli students don't identify as Jewish? Does that mean that they don't identify in a religious way, or do they not identify with the Jewish people? Are they identifying with other ethnic or religious groups in Israel?
Yeah, so to clarify, the Israelis that are either, responded to the survey, to be Jewishness at Columbia is often represented by attending Hillel, going to religious rituals, going to Friday night dinner, Shabbat dinner, eating kosher food. That for them, they said that is not how they identify on campus. So it's about religion, religious way. But I think it's really important to understand that when they articulate that they see themselves as Israeli, it is a national origin. And, there are many, many different foreign groups on campus, and they are the only ones who protesters said, we don't want this group on campus. So I think it then galvanized their understanding of themselves as a distinct group on campus. But I want to, as we're summing up, my research is the first of, I hope, many. I mean, in the journal, there's even another article about Columbia because there is so much to be thinking about. So it is not the be all and end all. It was driven by what the students, they did a survey. They did a survey of Israeli students. So I know that there are clear biases and issues. The side chat, I didn't say, it is anonymous and then it fades away. So they wanted to try to capture it. So it is really, as we talked about, this bottom up understanding of what the students saw as shaping their lives between October 7th and October 7th, 2023 and May 2024. It doesn't go beyond that. So I really encourage everyone here who's listening and everyone here who's on the panel with me, please do more research. I think there's a lot that can be learned from what unfolded at Columbia, and it's not what you've read in the newspaper.
Thanks, Rebecca. We could talk for hours, certainly. And there are a number of really interesting questions from the audience, but we do need to wrap up with our 3 minutes left. For each of the panelists, I would love to know what's next for your research, where you're focusing your work related to anti-Semitism, to campus, in general, in this current moment. Graham, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. So, I sent Nicole the link to the study that we've already published on non-Jewish students, what they think on campus, and so our next big unanswered question is, well, what about faculty? Especially right now, there's a huge amount of discourse about what faculty are teaching and thinking. Are they indoctrinating students? What are they? All this stuff, and also, what do they fear? Do they fear their political views are going to get them into trouble from various sources? And so we're in the middle of working on a study looking at what faculty at these sorts of schools think about Jews, about Israel, about teaching style in general, and about politics. And so hopefully that will be released very soon.
Thanks, Graham. Jonathan, what's next for you?
Yeah, so just coincidentally, I just heard yesterday that we got IRB approval to go back into the field. We're going to be speaking with some of the same students who we spoke with a year ago and get a sense of where they are holding now. How did their attitudes a year ago? How sticky were those attitudes? How do they reflect where they're standing at this point in time? I've heard anecdotally a lot of people talk about the impact of the last few months of the Trump administration, what some people would call the weaponization of anti-Semitism to attack universities. And that's one of the things that we're really curious about, whether that's affected the way that people are thinking. And in general, the people who told us a year ago that they were emotionally upset about, or they were emotionally unwell because of what was going on, has that settled down for them? Are they feeling like they've gotten over that, or are they still struggling in a way that they were struggling a year ago? So stay tuned.
Thank you. Vikki.
There we go. So I'm working on a new project that we're calling the OR Initiative, OR, to develop evidence-based ways to help young people engage rather than disengage around the conflict and anti-Semitism, and starting before college. So we're working on creating new curriculum and learning interventions for 8th and 11th graders to start developing these skills around civil discourse and knowledge generation in a digital environment in a developmentally appropriate way, well before kids get to college, Jewish and non-Jewish kids. I'm very grateful for 5 years of support to stand up that work. And so we're hard at work and we'll be officially launching early next year. But anyone on this webinar who's interested in following that is welcome to email me. And I'm happy to put you on our mailing list so that as that comes together and we start planning that convening, we can be in touch with you. And that email address is my first and last name as one word at chapman.edu. Thanks.
Rebecca, is there anything you want to add about what's coming up next in our last minute?
I'm going back to the 1870s, but I hope my students are continuing. And there's actually been, I've cultivated certain researchers at Teachers College who are continuing research. So I think there will be more coming out on Columbia and understanding everything that unfolded.
Thank you, Rebecca. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and all of you in the audience for joining us and for your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.